Alan, they call themselves cartel wives, and tonight the women married to El Chapo's top dogs in Chicago are themselves trying to escape the federal doghouse.
I mean, at the time, you're living that life and you're blinded by pretty much everything.
I mean, I was told she was sending out hits on people. I was told her brothers would kidnap young women, take them up to their mansion, rape them, pass them around the security guards.
Too often, we focus on brutal men when we discuss cartels and other criminal organizations. But women can be just as brutal. Sometimes, it was precisely the wives of famous narcos who pulled the strings and orchestrated some of the most ruthless deals. They ruled entire sections of the cartel while staying anonymous for much longer than their kingpin partners. They advised their husbands, or in other cases, killed them and took over their businesses. Today's stories teach us not to judge a book by its cover. Clara Laborin is one of the most mysterious narco wives out there. It was only after her arrest in September 2016 that her name started to ring in people's ears. For many years, she was married to the notorious Hector Beltran-Leyva, one of the founders of the Beltran-Leyva cartel. Hector and his 4 brothers worked alongside their cousin, El Chapo, to establish themselves as one of the most powerful cartels in Mexico. When the Gulf cartel leader was arrested in 2003, the Beltran-Leyvas moved in to take all the Gulf territories. As always, this resulted in a brutal war filled with innocent victims, chaos, and destruction. It was a promising decade for Hector's cartel, but it never made it to Sinaloa cartel level. Perhaps one of their undoings was going against El Chapo. Indeed, Hector made a switch of alliances after he thought El Chapo snitched on him and got his brother arrested. One by one, the Beltran-Leyva brothers were arrested or assassinated, with Hector getting captured last in October 2014. At the time of his arrest, there was a $5 million reward from the US for information leading to his capture and another $2 million from the Mexican government. Hector was famous for his violence. He was the kind that shot first and asked questions later. But for Clara Laborin, he was her other half. When the two met, Clara was a beauty queen, and Hector immediately fell for her. Reportedly, throughout her life, Clara was treated like a princess. However, Clara also liked to be part of Hector's business, and she was very smart, so she was in charge of the cartel's money laundering business. Around this time, she took the nickname La Señora. This put her in harm's way. Both officials and rival cartels were looking for her. In 2010, Clara was taken by a rival cartel. Her picture was put on the internet. She was blindfolded, her hands were tied behind her back, and there were weapons pointed at her. 13 days later, Hector secured her release, and Clara went back to work. Indeed, that was not a wake-up call for her. It was just the risks of her job, and she was willing to take them. After Hector's arrest, Clara took over the Beltran-Leyva cartel and attempted to raise it to one of Mexico's most powerful cartels once more. This generated one of the worst wars in cartel history. Clara's war took more victims than Hector's feud with El Chapo. She wanted to conquer every territory she laid her eyes on. Even locals and tourists lost their lives. Collateral damage to a woman's lust for power. In September 2016, Clara Laborin was finally arrested. A report said, Laborin Archuleta, aka Señora, was reportedly organizing an incursion into Acapulco, an area that was once the unquestioned turf of the Beltran-Leyva cartel. Her name has appeared in dozens of narco banners and messages left around the southern resort city over the past year. The city's homicide rate has spiraled, turning Acapulco into Mexico's most dangerous municipality in 2016. When she was arrested, she had 4 pounds of white powder and several firearms on her. It's safe to say she won't get out of prison too soon. In January 2023, El Chapo's son, Ovidio Guzman, was arrested for a second and final time and charged with murder, money laundering, and, well, running Mexico's most profitable drug empire. But the Sinaloa's crimes were far from over, and it was around the time of Ovidio's arrest that people started looking at his wife, Adriana Mesa Torres. Adriana was born in the mid-1990s to parents Ada Elizabeth Torres Felix and Raul Mesa Ontiveros. Raul, aka M6, was a notorious Sinaloa cartel general. Adriana's uncles, Javier Torres Felix, aka LJT, and Manuel Torres Felix, aka M1, were some of El Mayo's most trusted men. This is an interesting detail. Adriana's relations put her in excellent standings with both factions of the Sinaloa cartel, El Chapo's sons and El Mayo. When she was still a teenager, Adriana started dating Ovidio, one of El Chapo's oldest sons and a key member of the Sinaloa royalty. Before long, the two were married in a lavish ceremony. However, in Adriana's case, this wasn't just a celebration of love. By marrying into Sinaloa royalty, her claim to the throne is solidified. In many cases, when a kingpin disappears, the wife is given even more access to the business and the money behind it. And in the dog-eat-dog world of Mexican cartels, your husband will disappear, either in prison or in a coffin. Adriana grew up in a narco family, so she knew this all too well. In 2007, her dad was gunned down by authorities in Jalisco. 5 years later, Javier was arrested for homicide, illegal use of firearms, and organized crime. Months later, Manuel was also killed in a shootout. Then, the worst tragedy yet happened. Her little brother, El Mini 6, was killed after flashing his gun and lethally shooting a law enforcement officer. He was only 18, but he was known as the Sinaloa cartel's youngest assassin. He already had myriad murder charges under his belt. But in the cartel world, this is only a tragedy when it's someone close to you. When you're part of this world, you know these things happen. You just hope they don't happen to you. In 2016, El Chapo was arrested for a third time. This time, he was extradited to the US, found guilty of all charges, and sentenced to life in prison at the Florence Supermax. It's pretty clear he won't be walking free again or conducting his business from prison. But his sons had been groomed for years in preparation for this. Mexican authorities and the DEA have been trying to arrest Los Chapitos for years. In 2019, they arrested Ovidio for the first time, but he got word that the military was approaching his house, and his older brother, Ivan, unleashed his Sicario army on the soldiers. Sadly, the Sinaloa cartel managed to intimidate Mexico's president, and he released Ovidio just a few days later. But that doesn't mean the authorities stopped trying. In January 2023, the Mexican military raided his house again, and this time he was sent straight to the Altiplano prison, the one his father escaped twice.
The detainee was transferred from the place of his arrest to Mexico City in an Air Force aircraft. Army and National Guard personnel continue to assist the civil authorities in restoring public order and the rule of law.
As of 2023, reports suggest Ovidio might be extradited to the same prison as his father, where he will live most of his life in solitary confinement. If you feel bad for him, remember, he enjoyed feeding his victims to live tigers, waterboarding them, and putting chilies on their wounds.
They now say this drug lord, nicknamed the Mouse, has ordered the murders of informants, a rival drug trafficker, and a popular Mexican singer who refused to perform at his wedding.
With El Chapo and Ovidio behind bars, one might think that the Sinaloa days are one step closer to the end. But bigger fish keep emerging from the shadows, and Adriana Meza Torres seems to be one of them. And as it turns out, she was never an innocent bystander. When police arrested El Chapo in 2016, the DEA researched his network, and that started with his immediate family. First came his sons, Los Chapitos, and his wife, Emma Coronel Aispuro. But as the DEA looked at his sons' wives, they noticed Adriana was the daughter of M6 and an active Sinaloa member. Adriana was declared a person of interest. Her bank accounts were frozen, and she was investigated for money laundering. The DEA suspected her of diverting illicit money to other sources or spending blood money for a luxurious lifestyle. It turns out their intuition was correct. On paper, all Adriana had was an agriculture business, so why did she have a luxury villa, expensive cars, hyper-expensive jewelry, and an everyday Kardashian lavish lifestyle? The Financial Intelligence Unit of the Ministry of Finance and Public Credit has pointed to the woman as an alleged leader for the Los Chapitos organization, especially for the activities of Jesus Alfredo and Ivan Archivaldo Guzman Salazar, as well as Ovidio. So not only is she a part of the Los Chapitos, she seems to be in charge of their money. However, the Financial Intelligence Unit couldn't find enough evidence to convict her at that time. As of 2023, Adriana's defense team has managed to keep her out of jail, claiming there is no evidence to support the claim that she is tied to the Sinaloa cartel. It's pretty shocking this works, but at the moment, the prosecution is working hard to put her behind bars. Let's fly to the United States for a minute. Juliana Farai had something in common with Mexican narco wives. She was a beauty queen, albeit from Puerto Rico. Once, she was flying to New York when she crossed paths with a man called Frank Lucas. The mutual attraction was instant. In 1967, the two got married and had a baby daughter. But to all of you who don't know, Frank Lucas was one of Harlem's biggest drug lords. He inspired the classic movie American Gangster with his method of smuggling heroin in the coffins of fallen American servicemen, and he became the staple New York gangster character in so many movies that followed. He was also known for cutting middlemen and buying straight from Asian producers. At the height of his career, Frank made $1 million a day. As it turns out, Juliana was by his side from the beginning of his lucrative business to the very end, his death in 2019. And she wasn't just a supportive wife, she was a business partner. Frank's specialty was heroin, while Juliana handled white powder. After her husband was arrested in the 1980s, Juliana continued to rule their business and manage a successful white powder trade. When Frank was released in 1991, he became a key informant for the government. However, Juliana wasn't going to quit her beloved job. So she was a narco gangster even after her husband quit. Then, Frank suffered a terrible car accident that left him partially paralyzed. For Juliana, this was yet another reason to continue the business. They needed all the money for his treatment. In May 2010, she was arrested for trying to sell 2 kilograms of white powder in Puerto Rico. 2 years later, she was sentenced to 5 years in prison. 2 years after her release from prison, Frank Lucas died. At last, Juliana left her narco years behind. Obviously, we need to talk about El Chapo's wife. Emma is a full 32 years younger than El Chapo and is younger than his oldest daughter. On the other hand, El Chapo was married at least 3 times before her. In fact, according to journalist Annabel Hernandez, El Chapo never divorced his first wife, Alejandrina Salazar. That means that technically, Emma isn't El Chapo's legitimate wife. Confronted with this information, Emma simply stated they were married under the law of the divine, whatever that means. Emma started out as a trophy wife for El Chapo. She was only 17 when he saw her at a beauty contest and decided he wanted to have her. Emma won the pageant that year, and many believe El Chapo pulled some strings for that to happen. On her 18th birthday, the two got married in a ceremony filled with famous officials and high-ranking cartel members. Whether Emma married him out of love, fear, or love of money, we can never truly know. But her relationship with El Chapo changed dramatically, especially after his arrest. Until El Chapo's 2016 arrest, not much was known about Emma, except she was the mother of his twin daughters, Maria Joaquina and Amali Guadalupe. Emma tried to lay low and live a private life in the U.S. She even kept the father's name out of her girls' birth certificates. Clearly, she wanted to stay safe.
A ellas en California.
Como yo nací allá, se supuso que era buena idea que también fueran ciudadanas americanas.
¿Por qué es buena idea ser ciudadano americano?
Por si quieres vivir en otro país, pues Estados Unidos se me hace buena elección.
Every time Emma was asked about her husband's many crimes, she feigned ignorance. However, there was a $5 million reward for El Chapo's capture, and his cartel made headlines almost every single day in Mexico. Moreover, when El Chapo escaped the Altiplano prison in 2015, he escaped through a tunnel that led straight to a property bought by Emma. So she really couldn't deny her involvement in her husband's affairs. In fact, Emma would be convicted of helping her husband that day. But first, there was El Chapo's 2017 trial after his 2016 arrest and extradition to the U.S. Suddenly, Emma was all over the news, partying, purchasing luxury clothing, and dining at high-end restaurants. Her Instagram amassed 500,000 followers with just a few posts of her flashing expensive clothing. She became known as the Narco Barbie. Her husband getting sent away seemed to be a new lease on life to Emma. In 2019, she even appeared in a VH1 reality show on a yacht with the son of a Colombian drug lord. She opened a fashion line wearing her husband's face and name and gave interviews about what it's like to be a narco wife. Needless to say, the Sinaloa cartel was not happy about this. In the cartel world, there's an unwritten rule that drug lords' wives should lead a sheltered, obscured life. This might sound unfair, but isn't it just as unfair to flash your blood money riches? During El Chapo's trial, Emma showed up in a different designer suit every day. She did this in front of authorities and in front of cartel members. And in the courtroom, she either blew kisses to her husband or sat poker-faced as people described horrendous instances of El Chapo doing unspeakable things to people. Clearly, Emma knew all about this. Nothing seemed to faze her. Something else was revealed in the courtroom. A few text messages between the married couple. In the texts, the two casually chatted about El Chapo's bloodiest affairs. Then they joked about their kids growing up and joining the cartel soon. El Chapo wrote to his wife, "Our Kiki is fearless. I'm going to give her an AK-47 so she can hang with me. Emma is fearless too, albeit not in the right way." According to Annabelle Hernandez, Emma's lavish lifestyle during El Chapo's imprisonment is her revenge. As it turns out, El Chapo was repeatedly unfaithful to Emma, while she was the most loyal wife he could wish for. She protected him, covered for his crimes, helped him escape, and put herself in harm's way for him. So the minute Emma realized her husband would never leave prison again, she decided to make him see what he was losing. However, she dug her own hole this way. In February 2021, she was arrested and charged with money laundering, drug trafficking, and helping El Chapo escape prison and run his drug empire in numerous ways. The former beauty queen appeared before a federal judge in Washington, D.C. on Thursday morning and pleaded guilty to participating in a conspiracy to distribute cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, and marijuana for importation to the U.S. Emma will be spending 3 years in prison, but after her release, she might have to live on the run. Reportedly, the DEA is trying to cooperate with her in order to bring down as many Sinaloa bosses as possible. If she does that, she might get a reduced sentence and perhaps even immunity for her daughters. Cooperation with the DEA might be Emma's ultimate revenge on her husband, but will that earn her a death warrant? And are her twin daughters safe? The last two women we'll cover today are not really narco wives. They are very much the main characters in their story and illicit businesses, and the husbands they had, well, let's just say, they didn't meet the happiest of endings. Sandra never had a chance at a regular life. She was born into the Sinaloa cartel. Her mother's family were notorious heroin smugglers. Her father, Alfonso Avila Quintero, was the brother of the Guadalajara cartel leader, Rafael Caro Quintero. And if that name doesn't ring a bell, Rafael was the founder of the notorious Guadalajara cartel, alongside Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. These were the first Mexican kingpins to strike a deal with Colombian white powder producers and move their product into the States. The Guadalajara is also the cartel that El Chapo and El Mayo worked for before the Sinaloa even existed. In fact, the Sinaloa cartel started out as a tiny plaza, or fraction of the Guadalajara. So little Sandra's childhood was filled with ruthless narcos flaunting blood money and threatening each other into submission. Sandra learned early on that Mexico is seriously corrupted, and that if you wanted to make big bucks, you had to exploit this side.
Pero no es nomás con el narcotráfico, hay mucha corrupción en cualquier ámbito social, comercio, empresas, tráfico de influencias con el narcotráfico, con indocumentados, en todo.
Her family was almost blaming corruption for their career choice. But it's because of people like them that there's so much corruption. Well, them and the officials that accept their bribes. Aside from a warped view of reality, Sandra was also exposed to unspeakable violence. She was only 13 when she witnessed her first shootout. This was a traumatizing event for her, but she was already involved in her family's cartel. She worked as her dad's money counter. Cartel dads are not exactly ideal parents. Sandra's dad gave her private tuition, piano and dance lessons, and trips to Disneyland on a regular basis. But he also exposed her to violence, made her participate in it, and left her prone to attempts on her life.
Un arjuelillo de un momento se atravesó un carro, nos cerró el paso y se bajaron dos personas armadas. Se nos pusieron de frente y inició el tiroteo. La persona que me iba siguiendo armada trató de salir corriendo para que no lo tuvieran y lo detienen cuando él trata de salir. Es como yo me salgo y alcancé a ver a Joel tirado en la calle, muerto.
Imagine losing your boyfriend this way. But for Sandra, this was normal. People walked the streets with pistols at the waist, with musicians walking and playing behind them. At dawn, you heard the music, the shootouts. It was when they killed the people, and she would lose several more partners before her arrest. In her late teens, Sandra enrolled at the prestigious University of Guadalajara to study journalism. She kept to herself and got excellent grades. Her college mates remember her as quiet, withdrawn, and very cautious. This might not be surprising, considering what she'd already been through. Sandra could have chosen a career in the legal world, but instead, she put her newfound skills to good use in the cartel world. She became a master money launderer. With that job came a long list of relationships with narcos. When she was 21, she started dating Armando Carrillo Fuentes, the boss of the Juarez cartel. Around this time, Sandra became a prominent figure in the Sinaloa cartel, overseeing illegal substance shipments to the U.S. Within a few years, the two broke up. Then, Sandra married a law enforcement officer. Wait, what? Indeed, Sandra's first husband was an officer. But by the time he married her, he switched sides. Sandra used her husband's intimate knowledge of the law to avoid arrest as she moved bigger and bigger shipments. Sandra escaped unharmed, but her husband was assassinated. In a bizarre twist, she ended up marrying another law enforcement officer, and the story goes the same. He switched sides, and then he was unalived. Another one of her rumored lovers was El Chapo himself. However, it's likely the two were just good family friends. Through this relationship, Sandra became head of public relations for the Sinaloa cartel. Then, Sandra was in a relationship with Juan Diego Espinosa Ramirez, also called the Tiger. The Tiger had strong ties to the Norte del Valle cartel in Colombia. This was just the open door she needed. Through Sandra, Colombian and Mexican cartels were once again united, and you can imagine how profitable that was. According to The Guardian, Sandra had a habit of carrying suitcases with millions of dollars in $100 bills. By the end of the 1990s, Sandra had a fleet of private jets, several mansions, and constant invitations to VIP parties, many of which became crime scenes after her attendance. Once, she bribed the Mexican president with $100 million. The most I ever heard about was a $100 million bribe to a Mexican president. $1 million is nothing. I've seen one politician look into the bag to see if it was there. He knew everything. Before 2002, Sandra also managed the impossible task of laying low and avoiding the DEA. No matter how big her shipments got, she found a way to keep her name off the lists and throw smaller people under the bus. But all that changed when her son was kidnapped in 2002, when she paid a $5 million ransom to get him back. The DEA started investigating her. Then, there was the incident that earned her the famous nickname. In 2001, the United States seized a tuna fishing boat transporting 9 tons of white powder. Indeed, this had been Sandra's main smuggling mode for years. And this is what earned Sandra her nickname, the Queen of the Pacific. In the early 2000s, Sandra Avila was on Mexico's most wanted list, but she continued to elude authorities for 5 more years.
No descansas. Estás cambiándote constantemente de ciudad, de casa. No puedes tener amistades, no puedes ver a tu familia. Es agobiante.
Finally, in 2007, she was arrested, Before being interrogated on camera, she asked an officer to give her a few minutes to do her hair and put on her makeup.
Su nombre, por favor.
Sandra Ávila Beltrán.
¿De dónde es originaria?
Tijuana, Baja California.
When the officer asked her what business she was in, she said, clothing. Even when she was convicted and sent to prison for life, she remained adamant that she shouldn't be there. For much of the next decade, she lived behind bars, but in style. While other prisoners had visits in a common room, Avila's guests were escorted to her cell, where her 3 maids served food, alcohol, and cigarettes. Jose Gerardo Mejia, the first journalist to interview her in prison, described Avila as a prisoner in 4-inch heels, adorned with jewels, custom clothing, and obsequious guards who acted with the airs of a low-ranking diplomat announcing the arrival of the ambassador. When she was denied restaurant-made food, Sandra claimed her basic rights were being violated. She never seemed to own up to her crimes or accept a more modest life. In 2012, Sandra was extradited to the U.S. and charged with being a key asset in the white powder trade. She pleaded guilty and got a 70-month sentence. Sandra ended up spending 2 years in solitary confinement for bad behavior. In short, she continued to behave like an entitled princess. Solitary confinement was a reminder that money doesn't get you anything. In 2015, she was released and is now living in Guadalajara. Inside the front door of Sandra Avila Beltran's home is an altar and lit candles that form a crowded shrine to her first husband, riddled by gunfire, her second husband, stabbed through the heart, and her brother, tortured to death. Sandra lost most of her money and assets, including 15 homes, 30 sports cars, and 300 jewels. However, she's not done being the center of attention.
Hola, buenas noches. Muchas gracias por todas las personas que han tenido interés en mi página. Esta es la oficial.
Yep. In 2023, Sandra Avila Beltran became a TikTok celebrity. She posts skincare routines and videos of herself rambling about the glorious days of her cartel life. Sandra has almost 300,000 followers on TikTok. She might want to use some of her internet fame to recover some of her money, or at least some of her fame. However, her lack of remorse over her actions or general cartel bullshit does not sit well with most people. Here's where it gets interesting, though. Sandra's husbands did not define her life or illicit career. They aided in her journey, but she was not an object of their desire or a side character to their story. For Sandra, her climbing up the cartel ranks and enjoying a varied romantic life were manifestations of female empowerment in the misogynistic cartel world. Women in this world are abused, discarded, and tossed out with little more concern than a child abandoning a Barbie doll. Narco leaders would keep a harem of up to 10 women, and this sexual freedom does not extend to their female counterparts. Women are looked at as objects, adornments, or a necessity, but never as a fighting being or a person made of triumphs and achievements. Her career triumph and the gold pendant on her neck carrying 228 diamonds was a middle finger to all the men who thought women couldn't make it in the narco world. If this list is ordered by brutality, Griselda Blanco, or the Black Widow, definitely tops it. Griselda was born in Colombia, into an extremely poor and abusive family. Her alcoholic mother subjected her to the worst treatment you can imagine. And if that's not bad enough, her mother's boyfriend essayed Griselda as a child, and her mother did nothing to protect her. This is how monsters are born. When she was 11, Griselda kidnapped a young boy from a rich family. When his family failed to pay the ransom, Griselda offed the boy. From then on, it was ever more chaos and destruction. Griselda became notorious for her hot temper and volatility. Age 19, she ran away from home and settled in Medellin, Pablo Escobar's hometown. She entered the drug trade before Pablo was old enough to create his famous cartel. During the 1970s, Griselda illegally immigrated to the U.S. and settled in New York. Then, she moved to Miami, sensing the surge in white powder consumption in the area. From there, she would oversee the Medellin cartel's notorious white powder smuggling. During the 70s and 80s, white powder was trafficked more than weed, and Griselda was at the center of the terrible drug war, or the cocaine cowboy wars. For the first time, officers were being gunned down in the middle of the day, and rival gangs would engage in shootouts in public places, endangering civilian lives on a daily basis.
The disregard for human life there at the scene was something that we had never seen or heard of here in South Florida.
Former DEA agent Bob Palombo commented, "Griselda loved killings. Bodies lined the streets of Miami as a result of her feuds. She gathered around her a group of henchmen known as the Pistoleros. Initiation into the group was earned by killing someone and cutting off a body part as proof of the deed. And even as she became the top of her own game, Griselda continued to personally take care of enemies. She enjoyed doing it. She was a 5-foot-tall mother of 4, but she was just as much of a psychopathic killer. She unalived 200 people with her own hands, not counting all the hits she ordered, and some of the victims were her own lovers. Indeed, Griselda murdered her 3 husbands. First, she was married to a petty forger named Carlos Trujillo. Carlos became part of her business, but when she discovered he'd used work money for personal matters, she started a heated argument that resulted in her offing him. Then came her second husband, Alberto Bravo. One day, Griselda became suspicious that he was being unfaithful to her, so she fired a shot straight into his head. In 1983, she killed her last husband after he left her, but not before butchering 8 strippers who she thought were sleeping with him. There's always divorce, Griselda. What's worse is she had horrific double standards. She would host orgies herself, but if her partners would so much as look at another woman, they would meet a grisly end. This is how Griselda earned the nickname Black Widow. At the peak of her career, Griselda Blanco made $8 million a month. Her unique method was through a line of lingerie she'd created. Every bra had a secret sewing where white powder could be hidden. Women wearing these bras would fly across the borders with no one batting an eyelid. This was also around the time when women were considered much less dangerous than men and subjected to fewer random searches in airports. On February 17, 1985, she was arrested in her home by the DEA. The agency had been on her tail for 10 years. It seemed impossible to catch her. The agent in charge was so happy that he kissed Griselda on the cheek. She was charged with conspiring to manufacture, import, and distribute coke, and sentenced to 15 years.
The fact that the homicide rate dropped dramatically after she was arrested.
Following her arrest, 3 out of her 4 sons were offed, and her surviving son, Michael, survived 7 attempts on his life. In 2004, Griselda was released and deported to Colombia. In 2012, age 69, Griselda was visiting a butcher shop with her pregnant daughter-in-law when 2 hired assassins jumped off their motorbikes and aimed for her head. Ironically, she died by the method she'd invented, the drive-by shooting. It was the only kind of ending the cocaine godmother could meet. Some women became narco wives for the lavish lifestyle and princess status they would get.
I mean, at the time, you're living that life and you're blinded by pretty much everything.
What you see on TV, when you see the Kardashians, that's the type of lifestyle that we lived. You have so many people now today on social media that glamorizes that lifestyle, and I think that they don't realize what this life is about. It's about destruction. It's about violence. People are getting killed. People are being tortured.
Other women have a thirst for power, money, and blood just as high as their male counterparts. Narco wives or narco widows, women have proven they can be just as brutal as men.